Hello, and thank you for joining me for episode 36 of the Aviation News Talk podcast. Coming up in the news, the city of Santa Monica continues to undermine their airport by trying to shorten the runway, but this week there's a new twist to that story. And for years, pilots have been predicting that eventually a drone would strike an aircraft. Well, that prediction came true along with serious damage to both drone and aircraft. And the FAA is proposing to save money by eliminating a huge number of this kind of instrument approach. And finally, if you have access to most any vintage aircraft, there's someone who wants to pay all of your expenses for a 6-week trip through 19 countries. And we'll tell you who wants to foot the bill. Then later, we'll be talking about results from our listener survey on what flight planning tools that listeners use and the process that they go through to plan a longer flight. Welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk about general aviation. I'm Max Trescott. I'm here to help you fly more safely, whether you're a pilot or student pilot, by sharing my over 40 years of experience as a certificated pilot, author, 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year, and specialist in Cirrus aircraft like the SR-20 and SR-22. Now, last week we talked about when you can use GPS on non-GPS approaches, such as an ILS or a VOR approach. So if you missed that episode, please check it out. Plus, we have so much more coming up, and it all begins now. From Plane and Pilot magazine, a U.S. District Court judge has issued a temporary restraining order, which has given the Santa Monica Municipal Airport a little bit more breathing room. Now, this was granted in response to an emergency application, and it orders a temporary halt to the runway. They call it construction project. We know it's a destruction project. That's where the city is going to try and reduce the runway from about 5,000 feet down to 3,500 feet. Well, that destruction was going to start on October the 9th, but the TRO came out on Sunday the 8th, which is really very much a last-minute save. Now, in issuing the temporary restraining order, the judge noted the validity of safety concerns raised in the application. And in the application, they pointed out the risks that were posed to both pilots and people in the neighborhoods because of the lower flight paths that would be created by shortening the runway. Now, the application was submitted by a flight student who's a resident of the city, and in order for it to have been granted on an emergency basis, one of the legal requirements is the court must be convinced that the case is likely to succeed based on its merits, meaning in this case that it looks like the individuals who filed the application have a sound legal argument for halting the project, at least temporarily. So the city has until October 13th to file a response, and from there a court hearing could decide whether the runway project will remain on hold while the case goes to trial. From the Wichita Eagle, Wheels Up is back in the news. You may recall we talked about them a few months ago, and I mentioned that they were buying a lot of King Airs and that it might be a good place to go for a job if you're looking to build some twin-engine time. Well, this story says they've just received another round of $117 million in financing, and that comes after a $90 million round of financing from the private equity firm KKR. They now have an estimated value of $1 billion. So go ahead and sit up if you haven't heard of them before. That's a lot of money for an aviation startup company. They currently offer individual and corporate memberships, and what they say is that with 24-hour notice, any of their members can use a web or smartphone application to have one of these aircraft show up. And they currently have 65 King Air 350 turboprops, 15 Cessna Citations, and a commitment to buy 105 King Airs. So this is really a huge operation. I hope it works out for them. They currently have 4,000 members. They say the goal is to increase that to 10,000 members by 2020. Now, individual members to join, you pay a $17,000 initiation fee plus an hourly aircraft usage fee. But after the first year, that annual membership is just $8,500. A little rich for my blood, but it certainly sounds like fun. Well, it did finally happen. The NTSB has tracked down and interviewed the pilot of a DJI Phantom 4 quadcopter that was destroyed when it hit a U.S. Army Black Hawk helicopter flying at low altitude just off the shoreline of Staten Island, New York. Now, the collision damaged the helicopter, and that crew had to make an emergency landing. Agency reported that the drone pilot, who they've located, has provided flight data that will assist in the NTSB's first ever investigation of a midair collision between manned and Aviation unmanned aircraft. The NTSB sent out investigators. Initially, there were published reports saying that helicopter was flying at 500 feet, though an NTSB spokesperson said that they have not established the altitude at which the collision took place. Now, there were 2 Blackhawks which were assigned to security patrol during the United Nations General Assembly. The NTSB announced on October 5th that they had recovered a part of the DJI Phantom 4, a motor arm that was stuck in the aircraft, and that from that they were able to identify the Phantom pilot who turned over flight data from the drone. Now, they also said that drone maker DJI participated in the investigation. Presumably, some of these drones communicate back with the company when they fly, so that may have helped them identify who the pilot was. According to previous reports, the Black Hawk landed safely at Linden Airport in New Jersey following the collision, and damage to the main rotor required blade replacement. Now, interestingly, a temporary flight restriction was in place at that time to protect the UN gathering of world leaders, and so it's quite possible that that drone pilot was violating that TFR. And from Flying Magazine, written by friend of the show, Rob Mark, he says that Garmin has just released 3 new touchscreen displays. They're called the TXI series, and they are the G500, G600, and G700 TXI. And one of these is a 10.6-inch display. The other 2 are 7-inch displays. And Rob says that you can orient these different ways, portrait, landscape, giving you a lot of different possibilities to mix and match. And Garmin says that these touchscreen displays all play nicely with their GTN 650 and 715 GPS units. The displays are approved for over 600 aircraft make and models in 26 different cockpit configurations. Pricing for the low end, the G500, that ranges from $11,995 for the 7-inch display and goes up to $15,995 for the 10.6-inch displays. The G600 and 700 are more expensive. And from General Aviation News comes this story about UND, the University of North Dakota. Now, we talk a lot about Embry-Riddle, which is the largest aviation university here in the U.S. I believe UND is probably the second largest, and they've just announced that they're establishing a $1.5 million scholarship endowment for high-achieving students to earn their wings through the college there. The endowment was made possible through matching contributions of $500,000 each, and part of that came from the James C. Ray Foundation. He was apparently a great supporter of the school, gave them over $25 million during his lifetime. He just recently passed away at the age of 94. Now, these scholarships apparently are trying to increase the pool of dollars available specifically for high school seniors. So if you're in high school and you're thinking of going to school, there are some more scholarship dollars now available at the University of North Dakota. And from AOPA comes the story that BasicMed has been wildly successful. They say that more than 20,000 pilots have now completed the various steps for BasicMed, and this program just started on May 1st, so it's only been around for 5 months, so I think that's remarkably successful. I just looked up the requirements yesterday because I met with a gentleman who is a retired FedEx pilot. He's been out of the air for 15 years, wants to get back into it. So I let him know that this was now an option. And just to refresh your memory on this, you'd be limited to aircraft with 6 seats or less, weighing not more than 6,000 pounds. You would not be able to fly higher than 18,000 feet, and also can't exceed 250 knots or operate for hire or compensation. And the process would include printing off a copy of the BasicMed Comprehensive Medical Examination Checklist and filling that out, taking it to get a physical exam with your doctor, and then go complete a BasicMed online medical course. And of course, this article says that if you want more information, you can contact the AOPA Pilot Information Center hotline at their 800 number, which all AOP members will have on their membership card. And instrument pilots, you're going to want to take note of this. This comes from AINonline.com. The FAA is talking about canceling a large number of circling procedures. Now, they say that this will help reduce their cost, and they say basically they're going to evaluate each circling procedure, of which there are thousands, against a number of criteria, including, is this the only instrument procedure at that airport? Obviously, in that case, they're not going to cancel it. Are there multiple procedures that serve a single runway end? And is one of those with the lowest circling minimums, for that particular runway? And a whole bunch of other criteria. They say that as new technology facilitates the introduction of area navigation, that's GPS, instrument procedures over the past decade, the number of procedures has nearly doubled, and they say the complexity is adding cost. They say there are approximately 12,000 instrument approach procedures in nearly 10,600 circling lines of minimum. So they're going to be asking for comments by November 6th on this proposal, and we'll have a link in the show notes where you can find that article and send your comments. My comment would be that they need to leave enough of them for training purposes, because circling is a requirement on the instrument check ride. In fact, I tell folks it's usually one of the most difficult things on the instrument check ride for people to perform, because once you reach the minimums, you've got to maintain -0 plus 100 feet throughout the entire circle until you're in a position to land, which would be when you're basically on the base leg. So more changes here to instrument procedures. And speaking of instrument changes, here's yet another one. This comes from AOPA.org, and they say that the FAA, GA, aviation associations, and the charting industry are working to update instrument charts to try and make it easier for pilots to just look at the chart and know immediately what type of navigation is required for the entire approach and for any segment of the approach. So they started making these changes back in August 2017, and they started by adding a box near the top of the approach chart, just above the briefing area. And in it, it's going to list the type of navigation equipment necessary to enter the procedure at the beginning of the approach and to fly each of the legs of the procedure. They say that this box is going to be phased in as new procedures are added, and then they'll go back and they will amend existing procedures to add this box. Now, the title of the approach chart up in the upper right-hand corner is going to continue to list the equipment required to fly the final approach segment, such as an ILS or a localizer. And they say that currently equipment and performance requirements can be found in the briefing strip and in the plan view area, but that the two don't always list the same types of navigation equipment as being required, which can create confusion. And coincidentally, over the weekend, I ran into exactly that scenario where there was confusion. Let's see, my good friends here, Rob Mark and Jason Blair, had an article that appeared over the weekend in Flying Magazine in the ChartWise section, and they were talking about an instrument chart for New York's LaGuardia Airport, the ILS or localizer runway 13. And toward the top of the chart, it says radar required for the entire approach. And then down toward the bottom, it says that radar DME is required only if you're flying it as a localizer approach and not if you're flying it as a ILS approach. So that's a great example where there's some confusion on the chart, and hopefully these new changes will eliminate some of that. And our final story is really an interesting one, and it's got a very international flavor, and turns out anybody anywhere in the world can apply to be part of the Vintage Air Rally. So I want to thank Daniel for sending this story, which tells us that the next Vintage Air Rally is going to start on March the 1st, 2018 from Ushuaia, which is at the southernmost end of Argentina, and then it's going to finish 6 weeks later in Florida. Now, the best way to probably understand this is to look at the one and only Vintage Air Rally that was held before, back in 2016, where vintage aircraft were flown from Crete, the island of Crete in the Mediterranean, to Cape Town, South Africa. And in looking at some of the documents from that trip, they say the event was supported by Her Majesty's government's Great Britain campaign, and that is a campaign which apparently intends to showcase the best of what the UK has to offer to inspire the world and encourage people to visit, do business, invest, and study in the UK. Other major sponsors besides the government of Great Britain were Bushcat Aircraft and Jaguar Land Rover. So it's not clear who is sponsoring the 2018 rally, but this part is clear. They say that it's completely free, open to anyone, and essentially what they will do is if they select you, there is an application process. They say we'll transport you and your aircraft, apparently from anywhere in the world, to southern Argentina. And during this air rally, they say we'll take care of your food, accommodations, fuel, oil, permits, fees, immigration, insurance, et cetera, and then get you and your plane back to your home country from the finish in Florida. So I probably got your attention. Here's what you need to have access to: a vintage aircraft. So if you or a friend of yours has an old aircraft, I'm guessing that would be probably back from the 20s and 30s and maybe a little bit older than that, you can go ahead and go online to apply, but there's not much time left. The shortlisted teams, that is the finalists for being picked, are going to be chosen on November 1st. So apparently you've got the rest of the month of October to apply. And then you got to get cracking because you'll be notified on December 1 if you actually been chosen. You've got to then get your aircraft ready for shipping. And on January 1st, 2018, the aircraft will be collected from all over the world for transport to southern Argentina. The race starts March 1 and, of course, finishes April 14th at Sun and Fun in Lakeland, Florida, after visiting 19 countries over 6 weeks. So this really sounds like the adventure of a lifetime. Daniel says, by the way, he's thought it through and decides that he can afford to just drop everything and go ahead and go on this adventure. All he needs to find is someone with a vintage aircraft who is willing to fly along with him. So if you've got a vintage aircraft and you're looking for a partner, contact us at the show here and we'll get you in touch with Daniel. And I will put a link in the show notes to where you can apply to join the Vintage Air Rally. And that's the news for this week. Coming up, we're going to have results from our listener survey on what flight planning tools listeners use and the process they go through to plan a longer flight. Plus, listener questions. One airplane owner wants recommendations for adding an IFR-capable GPS to his Cessna 150. And at the opposite end of the spectrum, a 2004 Cirrus SR-22 owner asked what should he know before painting or adding vinyl to that composite aircraft. Stick around, we'll be right back with answers to those questions and more. And welcome back. Before I talk about how listeners go about flight planning a longer trip, let me give you a few quick updates. If you've been watching the news, you know we have been having wildfires all over Northern California. Fortunately, not in my backyard, but not terribly far away, so we see a lot of smoke in the air. Death toll is up to 1,500 homes and businesses already destroyed. Now, California Highway Patrol, the CHP, has been involved in the fire. A local news report says they rescued 44 people by helicopter from areas where people were trapped by the fire. And they did this by just flying around in the fire areas looking for cars that were on cut-off roads and remote homes. Sometimes they would land in the fields next to the homes to evacuate the people. And a friend of mine who works for CHP told me that they're also providing intel to the firefighters on the spread of the fire and providing evacuation information, alternate routes, and other traffic information. Now, I did post a video on our Patreon site that came from CHP, so you can take a look and see what these wildfires look like from their view through the night vision as they were flying along a couple of days ago. And longtime listeners to the show will know that I've been reporting on how general aviation aircraft have been involved in hurricane relief. And I just wanted to mention I was able to achieve a good deed this week through our podcast. A listener named Pablo, who lives in Ponce, Puerto Rico, had contacted me over a month ago about relief efforts that were being flown by pilots in Puerto Rico to support St. Thomas and St. Martin after they were hit by Hurricane Irma. Well, a few weeks later, of course, Hurricane Maria swept through Puerto Rico, and it occurred to me that it probably affected Pablo, and I hadn't heard from him, so I sent him a Facebook message to find out how he was. Now, a number of days later, he wrote back that he'd finally been able to get on the internet briefly, and that things were not good as you would expect. And on top of all the normal problems, he said he was unemployed. And so it was total coincidence that a couple of days later, I was on Twitter, and I happened to see a report from David Begnaud, who's a CBS News correspondent who's been spending a couple of weeks down in Puerto Rico. He said that FEMA was going to be hiring 1,000 people in Puerto Rico. And then a day or two later, he mentioned that they were going to have a job fair in Ponce, which is the town where Pablo lives. So I sent him all that information, and I heard back from him. He was able to get to the job fair and apply for a job, and he said that he never would have heard about it otherwise. So apparently communications are so bad that people are not even hearing about things going on in their own city. So we extend our best hopes and wishes to Pablo. And also thanks to everybody who has participated so far in our October survey on portable ADS-B receivers, basically trying to figure out, do you have one? Are you thinking of getting one? How's it been going? What do you like about it? And are you using any of the new ones that have just been introduced in the last couple of weeks that we've been talking about here on the show? So go ahead and go out to aviationnewstalk.com/survey and tell us about your experiences with ADS-B receivers. And finally, this is the part of the show where I talk briefly about some ways you can help support the show. Now, some of you have requested some of our business cards for the show, so you can post them on your bulletin boards. If you'd like to post an Aviation News Talk podcast business card up on a board so folks at your airport will find out about the show, just go to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page, email me your address, and I'll mail you a few of those cards. And I'd also like to thank some new supporters from Patreon in the last week. David Carter and Jeremy Waite have both signed on. Jeremy, in fact, is a local guy who I just met last night as he's interested in buying a Cirrus, so we talked about some of the different options available to him. In fact, I had a number of listeners contact me this week with various Cirrus questions, one of which we'll answer later in the show. Now, speaking of the Patreon page, I've posted a lot of different stories out there. You might be interested in seeing some of the videos. One is a really fun video from Queensland, New Zealand, a Airbus, I believe it is, descending down through the clouds, kind of threading through the mountains and through the clouds flying IFR. And I'll tell you, when you look at those mountains, you realize why you really want to be proficient in flying IFR. And if you're not, then you don't want to fly IFR until you've had some more recurrent training. So check out that gorgeous video in New Zealand. Also have a video of an airdrop from a very large air tanker, a VLAT, a 747, which oddly is based here in California, but has been in service elsewhere for the past few years because CAL FIRE hasn't certified them. Well, they gave them a contract back in August, just in the nick of time, and that 747's been in service dropping fire retardant on the fires here in Northern California, so you might want to check that out. And now here's an interesting story which has lots of lessons into it. There is a pilot who basically busted a presidential TFR. So we posted his story, and it was kind of interesting. He did not get an automatic 90-day suspension, which is pretty much what used to always happen to people who busted TFRs. So you might find it interesting to find out how that happened. Anyway, you can get to the Patreon page directly from your smartphone. Just tap on the artwork for your podcast app, whatever it happens to be. You'll see our show notes there, and in it there will be a link to the Patreon page. And while you're there, just go ahead and check out our goals and consider supporting the show with a donation by credit card. You can contribute just a couple dollars a month, and you can read about what goodies you'll get depending upon how much you contribute. So thanks for everybody who has been a Patreon supporter. You can get to that page by going to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome if you type all that in, or just go ahead and tap on the artwork and you'll find a link here on your smartphone app. Now stick around, because in 7 seconds, we'll be right back to talk about flight planning. Welcome back. Anybody who's been listening for a while knows that we do a monthly listener survey, and then I try and get information back to you on a future show to let you know what we learned on the survey. And I thought this was going to be fun because I knew I was going to be learning from my listeners about some of the different flight planning tools that perhaps I don't use, or features of tools I do use that I'm not aware of. And that's exactly the way it worked out. So thanks for everybody who took the time to fill in the survey. Over 80 people responded. And question number 1 was, what flight planning tool do you use most often for planning longer trips? If you use multiple planners, select the one you use most for longer, more complicated trips. Now, about 75% of our audience is in the U.S. The rest is from around the world. So we saw different apps leading in different parts of the world. But let me just give you the overall results. Let's see. ForeFlight, no surprise, comes up at 46%. So overwhelming majority of people are using ForeFlight as their main go-to app. Skyvector.com, about 10% quoted that as being the first place that they go to. Garmin Pilot, that was down at 6%. And then from there, the numbers get smaller. There was a tie between Flight Plan, and that's FLTplan.com, and Oz Runways, both of those 5%. Now, Oz Runways is from Australia, so folks here in the U.S. may not be familiar with it. Paper charts, the old-fashioned way, using pen and plotter and sectionals. 4% said that was their main go-to app for longer trips. Well, not app, but technique. And then 1-800-WXBrief.com, 3% said that that's where they go. Now, it wasn't clear if they're using the website or the telephone. That phone number also works if you use the phone. But I got the sense from reading that these people were mostly doing it online. From there, it really dropped far down. So we had 1% 81% of the respondents were using each of the three following apps, WingX, AOP Flight Planner, and Duwats.com, which is a service provided through the FAA. And then 20% came up with other. And others included things like Sky Demon, which is used a lot for VFR in Europe. And then for IFR flights in Europe, people are using either Euro FPL and Autorouter for Euro control. Out of Australia, Navplan EFB showed up. In Canada, pilots are using NavCana, especially the ASEP feature, which gives corridor NOTAMs, PIREPs, weather information, and other great information. FlyQ EFB, which stands for Electronic Flight Bag. FlyQ is an app that I've talked about several different times. I use it for some simple stuff, but not for flight planning. Voyager, which I'm not real familiar with. AirNav Pro. Finally, someone mentioned the Mermoz, MERMOZ, Mermoz app available in the Mac App Store. So let's talk a little bit about some of the flight planning tools that are dominant here in the U.S. So ForeFlight, if you're not familiar with it, is kind of an all-singing, all-dancing app, which has just about everything in it that you might want to use as a pilot. So it's got terrain and obstacle alerts, IFR and VFR charts and instrument plates. It's got all kinds of maps that are scalable, airports and FBO information, pre-flight weather briefings. You can file a flight plan. They also have a relatively new online flight planning tool, which if you're a subscriber, you can use. You just go to the internet, and that's convenient for some of those of us who like to sit at their desktop here at the desk and do some work. And then all of that information can be accessed through your app when you're out at the aircraft. So that's a way that you can use ForeFlight both from the desktop as well as from an iPhone. Now, I mentioned iPhone. ForeFlight is only available on iOS devices like the iPad, the iPhone, the iPod Touch. They do not have any plans for an Android version. But they do have some relatively new recent features, including ForeFlight Connect, which lets you display ADS-B in traffic and weather on ForeFlight. But to do that, you're going to need either the Scout or the Stratus portable ADS-B receiver. Now, ForeFlight Connect also has the capability to let you transfer flight plans from your tablet to the Garmin GNS series, such as the Garmin 430 and 530, and to the GTN series, such as the 650 and the 750. Now, to do that, you're going to need the Garmin FlightStream 210, and that's a Bluetooth wireless gateway. You can also transfer flight plans between ForeFlight and the Dynon Skyview glass panel system. Now, Dynon, of course, is the leader in avionics for the experimental home-built aircraft. And finally, ForeFlight Connect lets you transfer flight plans with Avidyne's IFD 550, 540, and 440 touchscreen navigators. Now, just this past summer, in July 2017, ForeFlight began offering the ability to display Jeppesen terminal and en route charts for just about any place on Earth. Best of all, if you already have a Jeppesen subscription for a panel-mounted GPS system in your airplane, you can then install the Jeppesen charts at no additional cost onto ForeFlight. Now let's talk about pricing. For the basic version, which has all the main features, the sectionals and the IFR charts and flight planning and flight plan filing and briefing and weather and so on. It also includes a logbook function, weight and balance. That sells for $99.99 per year, so basically $100 per year. They have a Pro plan, a Pro Plus plan, they call it, for $199.99, so $200 a year, which includes what they say are advanced features such as geo-reference plates and airport diagrams. And what that means is that if you're using an instrument chart in the airplane, you can actually see a little miniature airplane on the chart that moves around and shows where you are relative to that particular instrument procedure. They also have, in this Pro version, plates on maps, their hazard advisor, and synthetic vision on the iPad version, which would allow you to basically see a set of instrumentation that shows your current direction and attitude as you're flying. And then they have, at the very high end, their Performance Plus plan for $300, but that's mostly for turbine and jet aircraft. Now, here's something I didn't know the details on. If you have a One Pilot ForeFlight subscription, that allows you to use the app simultaneously on one iPad, one iPhone, one iPod Touch, plus a second iPad as a backup. And now I use it both on the iPhone and occasionally the iPad. Now, here's a little clue. If you happen to be a member of SAFE, which is at safepilots.org, that's the professional society for CFIs and other aviation educators. One of the member benefits, and I'm a member of SAFE and I use this, is 33% off on the ForeFlight Basic or Pro plan, which is pretty handy. Now let's talk briefly about Garmin Pilot, which is an app that's very similar to ForeFlight with most of all the features we've just talked about, with one huge exception, and that is it's also available on iOS and on Android. Now, it's also a little bit cheaper than ForeFlight. Here's the pricing for iOS, and I'm guessing the Android pricing is the same. First, like all of these aviation apps that we're talking about, there's a 30-day free trial, so you can try before you buy. Now, Garmin Pilot in the US, the standard edition is $75, but in Europe, the standard edition is $100. Now, the premium version is $150 in both the US and Europe, and that adds things like color-coded terrain awareness display, terrain and obstacle alerts, synthetic vision. Also, you get georeferencing, which we've talked about on your instrument charts, and you also have the capability to reference your Jeppesen electronic charts if you already have a separate subscription to them. And if you happen to travel all over the world, well, then Garmin Pilot offers the worldwide premium version, and that sells for $600 per year. Now, skyvector.com is an interesting site. It's free. It's not an app. It's a website, and it has maps for the entire world. And now here in the U.S., it's got a lot more detail. It has all the sectional charts, the IFR and route charts, and it's got fewer of some of those charts in other parts of the world. Oh, and here's a biggie. It doesn't have the instrument approach charts, but you're not going to use this in the plane anyway. It does allow you to layer on different kinds of weather information onto their map. You can show airmets, SIGMETs, TFRs, radar, and satellite imagery. And it's got a fairly basic flight planning capability. It lets you enter waypoints or airports, and that creates a red flight path on the sectional that you have displayed there on your display. And from there, you can actually rubber band the route around, and you do that graphically by taking your mouse and just clicking on that red line and then dragging it around to either avoid terrain or restricted airspace or anything else you want to go around, like Lake Michigan. It then lets you add these waypoints to your flight plan. And if these points that you've clicked happen to be random latitude and longitude locations, it's just going to add those coordinates automatically to the flight plan. Then you can export the flight plan to most of the apps that we've been talking about, or you can email the flight plan to yourself, or you can export it in Garmin's .fpl or Dynon's .gpx formats, which will allow you to then use it directly on those GPSs. It also lets you file the flight plan with Lockheed Martin Flight Services or get an online text weather briefing through them. SkyVector also displays fuel prices. So that's a pretty popular app. I don't use all of its features, but it's certainly a great way to get a very quick and dirty feeling for what route might make sense. Now let's talk about flightplan.com. As I mentioned before, flight plan is spelled FLTPLAN.com. It's a free online flight planning site that's been around since 1999, and you're only, of course, going to be able to use that on the ground. But they now have a companion app for both iOS, Android, and get this, Windows. They say that they are the only flight planning app that's available on all three platforms. Now, that app is called Flight Plan Go, and again, Flight Plan is FLTPLAN, second word Go, and it's also free. So my understanding is that you can do flight planning at your home computer, as we were just discussing with SkyVector, and then, or with ForeFlight for that matter, and then access that flight plan from your app before takeoff. So, make sure that's pulled up into your tablet, and then use it in the air while you're flying. And it has most of the features that you'd find in other apps, including the maps, the instrument charts, flight planning and filing, weather, and fuel prices. And I did see this note in pilotsofamerica.com. There was a thread talking about Flight Plan. And they said, especially if you're IFR, you might consider filing through Flight Plan. It is by far the most robust flight planning site in terms of the quality of planning, the breadth of its recent ATC routing function, and the accuracy of its en route calculations. They say, though its website is not pretty enough for some, they say there's a reason that this is the go-to flight planning site for Part 135 and Corporate Part 91 pilots. And of course, the flight plans created there would also be available in the app. So if you're looking for something free, or possibly as a backup to ForeFlight or another app you use, you might want to check out Flight Plan, FLTPLAN.com. Now, a few people mentioned 1-800-WXBrief.com. Originally, 20 years or more ago, if you didn't do a dial-up briefing through Duots, which is what we did before the internet, you'd use the phone and you would call 800-WX-BRIEF. WX, of course, is short for weather, and talk to a flight service station briefer who would give you a full weather briefing and enter your flight plan that you read to them over the phone. Later, as the internet became available, the service became online at 800-WXBrief.com and also 1-800-WXBrief.com. And from there, you can pull up weather charts and view them, get full weather briefing, file flight plans, and so on. Or you can still call the 800 number to do it. And all of that is free to pilots. It's paid for by the FAA. Okay, the second question was, if you'd like, and this is totally optional, briefly describe how you'd go about planning a longer trip. Now, I'm not going to read all of the responses, but I've chosen some that were somewhat representative. Here was the funniest one. I love this one from Anthony. He said, he flight plans carefully. I only have 23 U.S. gallons usable. Not very much fuel, unless you're flying diesel. If you're in a Diamond DA40NG burning 4.5 gallons an hour, that could last you a long time. Okay, from Travis, he says, for my long solo cross-country, I used SkyVector to make sure that the minimum distance was met. Then I pulled out my sectional and plotter to plot out the course and checkpoints. Then I go to ForeFlight and put in the destination airports, and then just put the checkpoints in as lat-long waypoints on the map itself. Then for the flight itself, I use a paper nav log for tracking leg times and for my headings. And from Clinton, he said, I like to do it on paper first and run the numbers, then go through my ForeFlight and see if my numbers are close. Keeps me in practice and not totally dependent on the tech. Good idea, like that. And then from JD, he says, I use the Weather Channel, which will be on television, and I use weatherunderground.com to start looking at the weather 7 days out. By the way, you could also use weather.com to do the same thing. Once I get within 3 days, I use ForeFlight's MOS forecast feature. Finally, I view the TAF, the terminal area forecast, via ForeFlight the day before. I use ForeFlight for all of the remaining planning, fuel prices, FBO phone numbers, flight plan, filing, etc. Now, MOS, for those who don't know, is the supplemental product that ForeFlight came out with, I think about a year and a half ago. And essentially what it does is it gives you a 3-day extrapolation and gives you kind of a rough forecast. Now, they say that it's a supplemental product and never a substitute for official National Weather Service forecasts. So keep that in mind, but it's a good way to get a little bit lookout beyond the 2 days maximum that you can get on the government websites. Okay, this one does not have a name, but he said, or she said, typically I start at skyvector.com. And by the way, a number of people said that. That's a real quick and easy and free place to get started. He says, I start at skyvector.com in order to get a good overview of possible routes of flight. From there, I tend to use the flight planning features available in skyvector.com, including speeds and altitudes. Once the high-level plan is complete, I switch to using flightplan.com and the Flight Plan Go app that we just talked about. This allows me to optimize altitudes based on forecast and winds. And yes, I think that route selector that I mentioned works great in skyvector.com. And of course, you can rubber band things around on the map as well. By the way, once you file through skyvector.com, you could later amend your flight plan by going to 1-800-WXBrief.com as long as you use the same email addresses for both of those websites. And this one comes from Hillel, rather interesting and quite detailed. I like this. He says, I start with researching and selecting the airport near my destination, then use SkyVector for quick and dirty ideal distance, time, and fuel requirements. He IDs the fuel and rest stops, and then uses the route suggestion feature, which we just talked about, to see if it suggests a viable IFR route. He says, I almost always start using an IFR flight plan for longer trips. That's a great idea, by the way, because if you run into bad weather, you're already in the system and you don't get delayed trying to get into the system. It says, then I rubber band the suggested route to accommodate the stops, adjust for diversion, airports, and alternates. He says, I'll often scrape the nav log, and I think by that he means he's exporting the data, and he's going to move that to a spreadsheet to create a more detailed plan with all the VOR frequencies and nav log type data. This also makes it easier to copy the route from tool to tool. As the route comes into shape, I'll create a bookmark folder of forecasts for weather along my route from my favorite short-range weather site, AirSportsNet. As the departure date and time approaches, I will start looking at the weather on these bookmarks as well as on AOPA's site. I'll also plug in the route into AOPA's flight planning site and turn on the Weather Along Route feature, especially on the final day. Finally, I'll export the route to Garmin Pilot and to ForeFlight and ensure that the instrument approach procedures are loaded. Since I have a GTN 650, which is a Garmin touchscreen GPS, I'll use Garmin Pilot to file my plan and then load the plan provided by ATC into the panel. So that's pretty slick. Take the plan he's created over the last few days, directly upload it into the GPS. While flying, I'll make most changes to the plan on the iPad, then upload them to the panel. If the change is a straightforward direct to, I'll do that on the 650 first and then update the iPad from that, since the user experience is still a bit wonky in the Garmin environment. Well, thanks, Hillel. And just for listeners so they know, airsports.net, I found that at usairnet.com. Looked at it, and they've got a very nice graphic in which you type in your airport. It then looks out 3 days and then gives you 3-hour intervals on sky condition, temperature, wind direction, wind speed, cloud bases, visibility, and a bunch of other factors as well, too. Now, he mentioned AOPA Flight Planner. You, of course, have to be a member of AOPA to use that. In that case, it's free. It's powered by Jeppesen, and it includes a lot of different features, including the ability that once you create the flight plan, you can then export it to your favorite app, whether it's ForeFlight, Seattle Avionics, FlyQ, WingX, and those kinds of things. And the Weather Along Route feature that he mentioned of the AOPA Flight Planner, I wasn't familiar with that, so I looked it up. Essentially what it does, it applies a corridor, kind of both sides of your route, certain distance, and it applies crossing times, kind of estimating when you're going to be at each of those points, and then it shows the weather at that location for the time you're supposed to arrive there. So pretty darn good way to keep track of your weather as it changes along the entire route. And from Chris, he says he starts with AOPA Flight Planner, but also does some work on Avare, that's A-V-A-R-E, since he says that's his in-cockpit tool that he uses on a tablet. I looked it up. Avare is available free from the Google Play Store, so that means it runs on Android phones and tablets, relatively small file size, and that no subscription required. They say that the developers encourage aviators to donate to the people who develop the app, so that's pretty cool. Open source free app. From Brian says, I usually start with ForeFlight, but use flightplan.com, especially for longer, more complicated flights. It has especially good ways to look for fuel stops and other resources. I wish FlightPlan would show which airports have on-field restaurants where you get food without leaving the FBO. The day before takeoff, I'll be looking closely at aviationweather.gov, which is the official site for aviation weather from the U.S. government, and calling flight service an hour or so before takeoff. Yes, I have run into this issue with trying to get food on the way, especially on long trips, and I have solved that problem. I always just get a large submarine sandwich the night before, keep it in the refrigerator, and that becomes for sure lunch and sometimes dinner on really long days. From Justin, he says, I begin by researching airports near my destination for fuel prices, access, and facility reviews. I then move to routing if it will be a trip requiring one or more fuel stops. I build a few potential routes and save each one. Yes, I do that too. I always have a couple different routes depending upon the weather. He says, as the current weather becomes available, I will select a route and suitable alternate based on current conditions. ForeFlight provides several nice graphical weather tools that I have found very useful in planning. And Jason says, I do all the research the day before, plotting out the direct routes, checking for airspace concerns, finding my waypoints, taking measurements, looking over frequencies, and so on. I also visit Google satellite maps to get a sense of the airport layout and surrounding structures and terrain, which is an excellent idea, Jason. If that were available when I did my first cross-country as a student, I would not have flown past the airport. And that was with the instructor on board. He was waiting for me to look at it. I had no idea which side of the town or the river it was on. Anyway, Jason continues. He says, on the morning of the cross-country, I do my calculations for true airspeed and ground speed and fuel burn. Lastly, I check weather, NOTAMs, and TFRs. Very important to always check for TFRs. And here's one from Gabriel. Gabriel says, I start with Weather Underground several days to a week in advance. That would be weatherunderground.com. Then I move to the forecast discussion on aviation weather. The day before, I use 1-800-WXBrief.com for a detailed briefing because I like the format better than ForeFlight. All the time I'm checking ForeFlight for upcoming TFRs, NOTAMs, and other non-weather planning. I love ForeFlight, but there are better tools for long-range weather. Sometimes for a first look, I'll check out a flight path online at skyvector.com and also head over to aviationweather.com for a weather outlook. From Mahesh says, I use aviationweather.gov for weather information and ForeFlight for figuring out the best route given terrain and weather, fuel stops, altitude, etc. The same weather info is available on ForeFlight, but I find the government site just easier to navigate for convective weather as well as for icing, and probably also for some of those turbulence forecasts, I'm guessing. I like those on the government site. Now, Aaron says, I use Garmin Pilot, but also SkyVector, AirNav, and Google Maps. I will also look to see if the airport has a website. That's a really excellent idea. He says the website could have preferred routes, arrivals, departures, and traffic patterns. And to that, Aaron, I would add check for noise abatement information on the airport website as well. Often we know everything about an airport except, oops, what we need to do to be a good neighbor and not fly over a noise-sensitive area as we're arriving or departing from a strange airport we're not familiar with. From Jeff, he says, I fly VFR, and this is challenging in the mountainous terrain that I live in the winter. I have some low elevation options for my most common destinations that are peppered with highway webcams. You'll have to start guessing where Jeff lives. He says, these are invaluable for instant and current sky conditions. Plus, I replay the day as stop motion video to see what the sky condition trends are. There are also airport cams at almost all my destinations, plus ski resort cams that give me views of mountain passes and valleys. I don't rely on all of these cams exclusively, of course, but they are valuable real-time tools in the kit. And he goes on to say, I live in Nelson, British Columbia. And he mentions a couple mountain ranges I can't pronounce. And he says that these are in the southern part of British Columbia. Very cool, Jeff. I wish we had highway cams available at some of the mountain passes here in the San Francisco Bay Area. It would be handy to be able to look at those. Now, this is from Bob. He's a ForeFlight user, and I recognize the name. I think he lives here in our fair city, Mountain View, California. Initially, I look at one of the overlays that indicates flight conditions. Are there areas of IFR, etc.? Then I look at the radar overlay to get a good feel for the weather locations. If I'm unfamiliar, I will try to pick up an ATC-assigned routing. A glance at the profile view gives me a sanity check on the route. I have found that the estimated time en route and fuel burn in ForeFlight to be pretty accurate. I brief the destination airport pages. If able, I will print a couple of charts for the destination airport. iPad overheats in the summer, no fun. Yeah, Bob, I have found that out as well, too. If you let that thing sit in the sun, by the time you try to get it cooled off, it can take you a good 10, 15 minutes to cool it down, even if you're using the outside air, as I have tried. It takes a long time to reset once your iPad gets too hot. Easy to do, especially if it's in a case or in direct sunlight. Now, from Sweden, Joachim says that he plots in SkyDemon and then studies the route. He says that the virtual radar is good help when flying around mountains. He then uses Meteo Earth, that's METEO Earth, with 5-day weather prognosis tool to plan for VFR weather. And that produces a briefing pack about an hour before the flight. And that includes magnetic heading, ground speed, and radio frequency that will be used, present weather and NOTAMs. He also prints in route charts and airport approach charts from SkyDemon as a backup. He says, I use SkyDemon in an iPad as the map and keep another iPad as backup. Great idea. I use the iPhone to back up my iPad. On the actual day of the flight, I also check ARO Web. He says it's a Scandinavian joint weather service for pilots and for Germany, and he uses GA4, which is presented in SkyDemon. Now, I looked up SkyDemon. I went first into the iPhone App Store, though it's also available, it turns out, for Android and for Windows PC and on the web. And in the App Store, it told me that I needed to go onto a website to create an account, but it doesn't tell you what the website is. I was able to search and find pretty quickly that it's SkyDemon, SKYDEMON.aero, AERO. And you get a free 30-day trial. It says it costs $98 per year, though the first year costs more. The first year is $153. And if I didn't mention it, it's available on the iPhone, iPad, Android, and Windows PC and the web. And from Scott, he must be from Australia. He says he uses Oz Runways to plan the trip, print out the flight plan details, and have backup phone and paper maps. And I looked it up. There's a 30 free day trial available for Oz Runways. And the price for VFR private version, $79 a year. The Australia premium subscription, $135 a year. And from Evan, who's also in Australia, he says that he uses Avplan EFB. He puts in the start and the end waypoints, looks at the distance, decides on the best waypoints and fuel stops along the way, checks the weather, selects the best cruise altitude, weight and balance, double checks the fuel on board, and then he goes to fly. Now, there are a number of different prices available for Avplan EFB. It depends on what country you're in, but they've got light versions and standard versions and premium versions. And some of the versions are available on Android, some are available on just iOS. And there's no name for this next one, but it's about 1-800-WXBrief.com. And the person says, in part, additionally, with flight plans you have filed with the site, it allows you to activate and close them via text messages. This feature is especially useful as a lot of airports I depart from don't have a center radio frequency or clearance and delivery frequency. So that is a really cool feature. I like that. Now, here's a long one from Ruben. Ruben has been a long-time listener, has asked a couple of questions on the show. Didn't know this about him, but apparently he's done some long-distance international ferry flights from Asia and Africa to Europe. He says he always starts off with Google Earth to plot the Great Circle route. Then he defines a safe cruise distance that he can make even with headwinds while maintaining alternate and final reserves. And then he figures out via Flight Safety Bureau any airspaces or countries to avoid due to political issues or war, and then figures out which airports are near the bisection of the safe cruise range and the Great Circle route, which diverts around unsafe airspaces. And then figures out which airports have the supplies required. And he says he's mainly thinking about avgas availability being extremely scarce outside the U.S., Western Europe, and Australia. He says once a basic itinerary has been drawn up, he figures out a schedule, flying 1, 2, or 3 segments a day, which should be conservative to account for unforeseen delays. And then he starts reading up on all the country's AIPs, the Aeronautical Information Publications, to check for entry requirements, exit requirements, equipment requirements, customs, immigration, disinfection requirements, etc. He says in the AIP, you should also find how to apply for overflight and landing permits, though generally we subcontract an agent specializing in these things. ACUWIC, that's ACUKWIK, is a very good resource to figure out fuel availability and local handlers and all their contact information. Last, the final part is the actual route and weather assessment, but to be honest, this is the easiest part to prepare for a long international trip, and also the part that has the most in common with normal, everyday, basic general aviation flying. And Ruben mentioned the Flight Service Bureau. You can find them at flightservicebureau.org. They say they monitor the world's airspace and airports for international flight operations, and they publish a weekly operations bulletin to 40,000 readers. Also, he mentioned disinfection. So that's something that's permitted between the World Health Organization and the ICAO, which allows countries to require insecticides and things like that to be used to try and kill any insects, either on the exterior surface of the aircraft or even inside the aircraft. And this one comes from Alan. Alan's a local guy here in Palo Alto. He says, in part, using ForeFlight, I determine the approximate route, navigate to an appropriate departure gate. And he says here in the San Francisco area, that would be Ultam, Sunol, Seeds. These are all fixes. And then direct to a reasonable fix in the arrival area. He goes on at the very end, says, I use a combination of ForeFlight and nFlight, that's ENFLIGHT, and aviationweather.gov. If I have questions about the weather or airspace I expect to encounter, I'll call flight service and talk with a briefer. And I thought that was really great to use an appropriate departure fix. I do the same thing when I'm headed southeast out of Palo Alto. I go initially to VP Pru, Victor Papa Romeo Uniform, the prune yard, because that keeps me about 5 miles due west of San Jose International Airport and out of their arrival corridor. Now, he mentioned nFlight. I interviewed the founder of nFlight probably 5 years ago at Oshkosh. That's enflight.com. It's a web app, and it's free for 1 month, or you can pay $99 for the web or $149 for the mobile version. And what's kind of interesting about it, they color code the weather based upon your personal minimums. So you can basically, mention what your minimums would be for VFR or IFR, and then they will color code it. And of course, when you get to red, that means that the weather is worse than your personal minimums. And they display these colors in a clock face near each airport, and it kind of spirals around the airport with the top position, the 12 o'clock position being midnight, the bottom position being noon, and all the other points being the whole day in between. And to make it easy, there's a white line that shows the current time. And from Matthew, Matthew says, in part, although I use ForeFlight, I always keep current sectional charts as well. For longer cross-country trips, I will always plot out the entire trip on sectional charts. I learned to fly before GPS was common and way before apps like ForeFlight, so I like the paper backup. I also like the paper charts because sometimes it's fun to not look at modern technology and keep your dead reckoning skills alive. Well, that's great, Matthew. Thanks for that. And thanks so much for everybody who participated in the survey. And my apologies, I have probably at least 20 of these that I didn't have time to read, but I really appreciate all the information you shared. So stick around. We'll be right back. Welcome back, and just a quick thank you to David in Melbourne, Australia. He left a review in the Apple Podcast app. He said, in part, there's something soothing about Max's voice that makes driving in crappy traffic way more bearable. That's great. Just don't fall asleep there. So appreciate the review. Anybody can leave a review. I routinely check the Apple Podcast app reviews. So if you leave a review on some other app like Stitcher or Google Play, let me know so I'll know it's out there. And here's some listener feedback. Brian says, your recent podcast on stabilized approaches is great. Now, that was episode 27. He said, I see some pilots jockeying with the throttle all the way through the approach. Down to 12 inches, up to 18 inches, back to 7 inches. Yes, I do too. Drives me crazy. He says, I believe that part of the success is to set it to the right numbers and let the plane settle in and then adjust speed with pitch. Amen. You are correct. This works especially well if you are at the correct AGL, as you said in your podcast. One of my instructors was a former Air Force pilot. He taught me the value of flying by the numbers, or at least to know what your target number is, whether it's an altitude, speed, descent rate, whatever. Thanks, Brian. And Don writes, FlyQ Insight is a really interesting app that you may want to take a look at and discuss on the podcast. And Don, we have talked about it, but I think you're talking about the new feature, which is augmented reality. And so when you take your iPhone, for example, and you hold it up, look out the window, it puts a little signpost in to show you where airports are located, which kind of helps if, it's a hidden area. He goes on to say, I have been having the most fun when I take a road trip and find all these little farm runways. So yeah, it certainly could help you find hidden runways. And from Greg Brown, we talked about him last week on his Greg Brown's Student Pilot Pep Talk group on Facebook. He had mentioned that he had discovered his iPad was draining even when he had it plugged in the airplane, and he discovered that reducing the brightness would help considerably. He wrote to add to that. He said, I just recently changed to the following USB charge adapter, which seems to do a better job of keeping up and has reduced iPad drain to near zero, though still not a positive charge rate. And there's a link here, which I'll put into the show notes. And now let's go to listener questions. Dave in Indiana asks, what would you recommend as a cost-effective IFR GPS for a 1977 Cessna 150M? The Garmin 430W would seem like the clear winner, but I have concerns about continued manufacturing support as well as unit installation cost. Would the GTN 650 be a better choice? My current airplane has dual VORs, one with glide slope. I also have a Stratus ESG transponder for ADS-B out and use ForeFlight with a Garmin GDL39 3D for ADS-B in. Maybe an IFR GPS is cost prohibitive in this airplane. I would certainly like the ability to fly direct and fly the occasional GPS approach. What are your thoughts? Well, Dave, first thing I think is that you've got a great sense of humor. I mean, anybody who asks a question about a cost-effective IFR GPS must have a good sense of humor. And also, it's kind of interesting. You've got a Cessna 150, which would be one of the lesser expensive airplanes. And so, that just makes the GPS even more expensive in proportion to the value of the aircraft, which is not to say that you couldn't do it. Now, a couple thoughts. Do you plan to keep your airplane for a really long time? If you do, go ahead and do whatever you want. If you're planning to sell it relatively soon, consider that generally when you pay for an avionics upgrade, when you sell an aircraft, you get at best about 50% back of what you spent on the upgrade. So you don't want to spend $20,000 on this airplane upgrading it if you're going to sell it soon, because you only get $10,000 of that back when you go to sell the aircraft. The other thing I would look at is, does the aircraft meet, your needs the vast majority of the time when you're flying instrument approaches? In other words, how many times are you not able to complete a flight because you lack a GPS in the aircraft? And that's going to depend upon which airports you're flying into, what kind of approaches they have at those particular airports, and whether or not VOR approaches are going to start going away in the future. We just lost one locally at an airport here. So, that's a consideration. You may find that even though you can get along without a GPS today, it might be harder and harder to do that in the future. As for what GPS to choose, I would talk with my avionics shop. I'll tell you the one thing I wouldn't do. I wouldn't go out on eBay to try and cheaply buy a used Garmin 430. I've heard a number of horror stories where people have done that and they end up having to pay thousands extra because the unit doesn't, meet various needs. Parts are missing and, different versions and all that kind of stuff. So talk to your avionics shop and they'll certainly guide you toward what will be the most cost-effective solution for you. Now, to help answer a listener question, I've brought in a guest. Roger Whittier is president of COPA, the Cirrus Owners and Pilots Association, and he's an A&P. He's also a Cirrus Pilot Proficiency Program instructor and a longtime SR-22 owner. Roger, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
So here's the question from Brian. He asks, what advice would you give to an owner planning to refurbish the exterior of a 2004 Cirrus SR-22? What considerations should go into the choice of vinyl versus paint? How about colors? New Cirrus seem to come in red, gray, black, or blue, gray, black designs. And are there other things to think about? Then he lists the name of a shop in Minnesota that he says he plans to use, and he says an update to the interior, seats, headliner, panel is also planned. So, Roger, what should he know about doing this?
Well, the first thing to know is that the painting for a Cirrus is covered on the type certificate data sheet. And there are concerns about making sure that there's enough resistivity so that the surface doesn't heat up in the sun. And then there's also a concern about protecting the composite layers underneath the paint so that it can't be degraded by the ultraviolet. So you should always refer to the type certificate data sheet for what's permissible on an airplane, but in a Cirrus, that's critical. Initially, the Cirrus came with just one color. It was a white, Cirrus white, and they used that for a good number of years. And striping is allowed, almost any color striping is allowed just as an accent, but the body had to be white. Starting in the mid-2000s, maybe 06 or so, Cirrus started experimenting with different colors. And one of the early colors was a nice red, and then there's also a Caribbean blue. And then slowly they added several other colors to it. Those original paints were Pittsburgh PPG paints. Later on, they were finding difficulty getting the kind of protection that they wanted, UV protection, that kind of stuff. So they ended up switching to Sherwin-Williams in the latter part of the 2000s. And when they did that, you started to see a number of colors come on board. Grays, dark gray, light gray, yellows, so on and so forth. And as long as they meet the UV spec, then that is a permissible paint. But that guidance should be followed clearly. Additionally, while black is approved for non-structural areas, like the cowling, which is not structural, areas of the fuselage and the wing, you're not supposed to use those dark colors except for accent striping.
What about any considerations for the CAPS parachute?
Well, the CAPS parachute has a number of things that you want to make sure remain clear. First, right behind the rear window at the top of the airframe is about a 12 or 14-inch square CAPS cover, and it's designed to be able to knock loose. You would not want to wrap that with vinyl, I don't think, because the parachute would have to punch through that, and anything that would impede that would be kind of a foolish idea to do. Once the parachute is out, then it has these two cavities that run down the side of the fuselage underneath the doors out to the firewall where the two other straps are attached. And those are Kevlar straps buried in the body. They would probably pull through almost anything because of the weight of the airplane, the size of the parachute. But I would definitely keep those areas clear and make sure they are only treated with the appropriate Cirrus-approved paint.
Was there any kind of change to the composites during the evolution of the life of a Cirrus? In other words, can darker paints be used on later model Cirrus?
Well, there's no restrictions on that, and Cirrus did start to use more carbon fiber in the later airplanes, but they didn't change the composite in the basic areas that you tend to see, the fuselage, the wings, so on and so forth. Using carbon fiber is an expensive proposition, and it is very useful for saving weight. But you tend to have carbon fiber on things like the wings bar and areas like that, but you don't tend to see those, and they're not what you're painting. So there hasn't been any real change that enables a different kind of paint. It simply was that paint met the tight UV resistivity spec that's necessary.
Now, Brian asked about vinyl versus paint. Any other considerations there other than the cap straps and the parachute area?
Well, you commonly see two kinds of paint applications on the Cirrus. From the factory, they tended to be a set of colors, and then they had a set of stripes, and those stripes were vinyl. The nice thing about vinyl is, of course, you can strip them off and put on new ones, or you can put on a different design, different color scheme, so on and so forth. And a lot of people do that frequently. Then there's some repainters out there, and I suspect the one he's talking about using up in the Minnesota area is a well-known shop that paints a lot of Cirruses, and they offer you the option, if you'd rather have your stripes painted on, then they will do that. There's an additional charge, but it really does look nice, and of course it's more durable in the sense that you don't get a scratch or a crack in the vinyl and then have to peel that away. So the ones I've seen by that shop, they have painted stripes just are strikingly beautiful. They use a lot of clear coat and whatnot, and so the stripes tend to be as shiny as the rest of the paint. So I believe at that point it's a cosmetic decision, a personal decision.
Now, is there anything else you think people should know when they go to paint a Cirrus?
Well, there's a couple of differences. On an aluminum airframe, you tended to use paint strippers and then strip it down and prepare the surface and paint it. The Cirrus has to be sanded because it's a composite material. The strippers don't work. And so at least on the majority of the airframe is composite. They have to be sanded down. If they aren't sanded enough, there's going to be a weight gain from the application of paint. So the shops that really know how to do Cirruses do a good job of prepping the airplane and sanding so that you don't have that weight gain that comes with putting paint on top of paint. Otherwise, the most important thing is, of course, abide by those paint selections that you have available. And now with those new Sherwin-Williams paints, a huge number of colors are available. I'm sure you can meet your desired look by any of the standard approved paints.
Roger, thanks so much for all that information. Now, for people who want to learn more about Cirrus aircraft, where can they find information about COPA, the Cirrus Owner Pilots Association?
Well, there is a Cirrus Owners and Pilots Association, and we're at cirruspilots.org. It's a nonprofit organization established around the whole Cirrus fleet, all the different kinds, SR-20s, 22s, turbos. We have just under 5,000 members right now as we speak, 4,900. You find that your dues probably pays for itself the first few times you log in with advice on paint or how to operate the airplane or other things. They tend to be a number of owners that deal with issues and are willing to happily share with you those so that you can drive more economical decision-making for your aircraft maintenance.
Roger, thanks so much for answering Brian's question today.
Pleasure to be with you, Max. Thanks.
And that's all the time we have for questions this week. If you have a question you'd like answered, go out to aviationnewstalk.com, go up to the top, click on listener question, and then record your question so we can hear your voice. Or just go ahead and send me an email. Go to the same website, click on contact at the top of the page. Always love hearing from all the listeners. Best way to contact us with any question or any feedback, aviationnewstalk.com, and click on contact. And if you think that someday you might be buying a new or slightly used Cirrus, please contact me now. I'll be happy to help arrange a free demo flight for you if you're considering a new Cirrus and help you understand the many factors, not all of which are obvious when you're trying to decide between new versus used. I specialize in the Cirrus and work with people around the country. And if you love this show, please show your friends how to find this podcast. A lot of the apps, like the Apple Podcast app, have a share button. Just click on that and you can share this directly with your friends via email. And until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.